record on this computer. Okay, so thank you for your patience. Here is an introduction to promises, as promised. No, okay. So, all right. So my introduction to promises. Why promises? So this is a cleaner way to do asynchronicity. It's not like you can do things with promises that you can't do with callbacks, but the code is cleaner, and that's the goal. All right, and so the advantages to the promises are avoiding callback hell. So how many of you have heard of callback hell? Yeah, what is it? Callbacks and your callbacks and your callbacks. So it leads to this kind of pyramid structure where, you know, you want to have a callback for this one, but then within that callback, you need another callback. And within that callback, you need another callback. And so in order to make things synchronous, essentially, do one thing after the other, the only way to do it with callbacks is to nest them. Promises take care of that. So, so what you can do is you can chain your asynchronous calls rather than nesting them, which makes this flatter program structure. You don't, wait, hold on, where'd I, okay. Which makes this flatter program structure where you don't have this like trying to figure out what's going next by looking inside all of this nested information. And then you also have this opportunity where you don't have to give an error function, an error callback for every single async thing that you're doing. Instead, you can give an error callback that will catch any error that happens in any of your promise chain. So that also simplifies things if you want to do the same thing for any error that occurs in your chain of promises. Whereas with callbacks, there's no option to do that. You have to specify an error function for every single callback. Advantages to promises. Okay. All right, please somebody tell me you get this reference. This song was going through my head the entire time I was working on this lecture. No? Sounds familiar. What, you want me to sing? I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking of the right words to say. I know they don't sound the way I planned them to be. Anyway, it's yeah. yes. Thank you. But it's a song I think called "The Promise" from the '80s. Look it up. It's a great song. All right. All right. So definitions for promises. All right, so a promise is a JavaScript object. It's just like date, it's like regex, it's like an array. It's just a kind of JavaScript object. The promise gets returned synchronously from a function. And you can have a promise outside a function, and we'll talk about that at the end of the lecture. But in general, your promise is going to be returned synchronously from a function. The function returns the promise before the async operation has actually finished. And the promise represents that async operation and its eventual success, failure, and return values. Then promises have these methods, then and catch, which I'm sure you've all used, where you can give callbacks for the success or failure. But the bottom line is the JavaScript is an object, and often if you want asynchronicity, you'll have a function like the .any for PG promise that returns a promise. That promise can have 3 different states. It can be pending, meaning that async operation is still running. We don't know whether it has been fulfilled or rejected. And sometimes we call that settled. The promise has been settled if it's been fulfilled or rejected. The promise can be fulfilled, which means, hooray, your async operation succeeded. And your promise could be rejected, meaning the async operation failed. Here's a link. I don't even know what's going on here. Just want you to go away. No, I'm not allowed. Okay. Here's a link somewhere. Hold on. Sorry to those of you watching at home. Okay. The states and fates is a link to more just vocabulary. States being pending, rejected, fulfilled, or rejected. Fates meaning the promise can be settled, not settled. Okay. All right, questions on vocabulary. Pause for a minute.
So states and fates. States is whether
yeah, I want to click on that link, but I can't because this thing is completely in my way. So let me go here. All right, yeah, so states is fulfilled, rejected, or pending. And then fates, they have resolved or unresolved. Yeah. And then they relate the two. And okay. So there are two things we can do with promises. We can use promises that other people have made, or we can create our own promises. So, and most of my research for this lecture was done on MDN, and I liked this phrase. Most people are consumers of already created promises returned from functions, right? You guys probably in your programming haven't had much of a reason to create your own promises. Instead, what you do is you run functions from PG promise, and they return a promise, and you consume it, right? Yes, no?
I remember reading that line and being, I don't understand what this is saying.
Yeah, so basically what it's saying is you as a programmer, as a developer of an application using Node, you are not making promises yourself. And we will talk about at the end of this lecture what it means to make a promise yourself. But making a promise is like saying, you know, const my promise equals new promise, right? It's like making an array or making a date object or whatever. You don't really make promises. What you do is you use promises that were implemented by creators of modules. You use the promises from PG Promise. You use the promises from Fetch, or you use the promises from, you know, HTTP or whatever you're using, right? So you are consuming those promises that somebody else created. Other questions on that?
So the other day I saw an example where somebody modified the prototype change of the promise and like kind of did something like some functional stuff. Would that be technically like creating your own promise, or are you still just modifying it already?
No, it sounds like that is making changes that are going to affect all promises. Right, if you're modifying the prototype of a promise, is that, yeah.
It kind of seemed like
Yeah, I mean, definitely in the scope of not just consuming promises. Yeah, but there it sounds like you're making fundamental changes to how promises are going to work in this program.
a little bit kind of modifying how they work.
Yeah. So, but that's different from creating a promise that works the way you expect promises to work. Yeah, for now, let's just talk about using promises, and then at the end, I'll talk about creating promises, and hopefully that will make the distinction clear. Okay, so here's just a simple example. You guys have all used this. So I'm using PG Promise here. Do you guys know select now? It's just so if I just go into pSQL and I do select now, it just gives me the date. That's just something I can do easily without having to have a database schema. So fine. So it gives me one column called now, and it gives me the date. And then we do a dot then. The dot then says if this promise gets to the fulfilled state, that state where the async operation ran. In this case, what's the async operation? Getting the data from the database, getting the response from the database is the async operation. If that runs and it's successful, then it's going to run this callback. And different promises have different data that they're going to give you back. The db.query promise gives me the data from the database, the data that was returned for that query. And it gives it to me in this array of rows. And each row is is an object with key value pairs for column and value. And that's something that I would find out by looking at the documentation for db.query. Some might give you more than one. Some might give you, multiple arguments to the callback. Again, that's just going to be in documentation. But db.query is a function that returns a promise. So let's look at this. I have some pre-written code that just so I don't have to spend a lot of time copying and pasting. That is not the pre-written code that I wanted. Okay, so here, all right. So here's this DB query. This should look exactly like what was in there. Maybe it's a little different, but what I'm doing is I'm taking that data. I'm taking the row 0, which you only get one row for that query. You just get this one row here. And you only get one column, and the column is called now. So I'm just taking the row 0 and the column called now. And I'm saying that's my date string. And then I'm going to console.log, it is currently date string. So actually, let's just make sure that, okay, good. So, all right, so great. It is currently Wednesday, blah, 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 blah. Okay, very basic. I'm curious, what if I said const result equals db query select.now? What is result? What is the data type of result? It's a promise. Result is a promise. And then if I wanted to do stuff on results, I could do results.then. That's going to do exactly the same thing. Just breaking it out. I was doing some chaining before, but now breaking it out. This is the promise that this is returning, and I can do .then on that promise.
So it's an object. You can just, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why I'm like doing simple basic stuff, because I want to really like you guys to have a really strong grounding in what's going on. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back here. What if I do a console.log done running db query there? What is going to what is the console going to look like? Oh, this, by the way, this is I didn't correct these. This data is just an object. So really, I'll correct these slides before I send them out, but you need to like pull out exactly what you need from the object before so this it is currently data is you need this line here. Hold on. Let me just put that in because that'll make me happier. Oh, close. Okay, so Right. So what's the console going to look like? Which console log?
Oh, sorry, the bottom.
The done running DB query is going to show up first. Why, James?
Because DB query is running asynchronously, and so instead of waiting for this data to happen before it returns it, but the console log is just going to come right down to the bottom.
Yeah. So the way it works is Node is going to run this statement, and it is going to return from this statement immediately. The consequence of this statement is that this then callback, this fulfillment callback, is going to be part of the event loop, and it's going to be waiting and looking at that. But while it's waiting for this asynchronous operation to return, it's going to go ahead and run the next line of code. This line gets run immediately. And then this callback is going to get called based on the event loop. But while the event loop is waiting for it, Node is going to continue running everything else. That's asynchronicity. It is non-blocking. Does that make you happy, Theo?
I just want to take a look at everything. So just as you were saying, so as the promise is kind of doing its thing, it's kind of waiting around, it's going to go ahead and run the bottom console, mainly because it's not synchronous. It's not saying stop, wait for me, then go. It's saying, hey, as I'm doing something, do this too.
Exactly right. Yeah, and great vocabulary, right? So it is going to run that callback that tells us it's currently date string asynchronously, and synchronously it's going to run that console log. So the order of things is it is going to register that it needs to run this select now query. And when that select now query comes back, I want to do this. Then it's going to run this line. And then the select now query is going to come back, and then it'll run this. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's, oh, I don't think I uncommented this line. So. Yeah, so done running DB query first, and then it is currently Wednesday. You guys good with that? Questions on that? Okay. All right, what about errors, right? If I run in pSQL, if I run select a pony, I get an error. That is not a valid command. So if I change, I'm just going to comment all of this out for now. And when I was doing this, so if I change this to select a pony, what is the state of this promise going to be after the query has been run? Your choices are pending, fulfilled, or rejected. Rejected. Yeah, it's pending until it's been run. And then after it's run, it has to choose. Is it fulfilled or is it rejected?
Oh, so pending is just before you do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, got it.
Pending is while it's waiting for that async operation to finish. Okay, so dot then only runs when you have, so yeah, dot then only runs for fulfilled promises. So let's take this. We're we're expecting the dot then not to run. Okay, and what we get is this unhandled promise rejection. Have you guys seen those before? Yeah. James and I were working with unhandled promise rejections a lot yesterday. Basically, I got an error. That column A pony does not exist. Looks like a familiar error from what we see up here. But, yeah, so it's warning me that it's not good to let rejections go unhandled. And in the future, it's not going to be so nice as to continue running my code. It's just going to stop running my code if there's an unhandled promise rejection. So the way we handle the promise rejection is we do a dot catch. That's the callback if the promise gets rejected. All right, so
This is the first time I've seen catch where you didn't have to throw the error. So the error is the catch. I guess.
well, yeah, so the argument to the callback is the error. So, and that's an error object. That's a JavaScript error object. And so I'm going to just do a toString on that error object to get its string format. So, and I'm going to console something went wrong and the error. And yesterday with phase 1, I was talking about console.log versus console.error. Console.error writes to standard error instead of standard out. And so if it's going to be an error, it's good to write to standard error. Okay, so let's go back here now. Standard error is a different stream that gets dealt with differently in the shell. For example, when you redirect output using the greater than sign, that will only redirect standard out and not standard error. I can talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to necessarily totally derail this, but yeah. Okay, so now we did not get an unhandled promise rejection. We got, uh-oh, something went wrong. Column A pony does not exist. Cool. All right, so questions about anything we've talked about so far?
Is that, do you know if that's a usual thing that they're having to use a toString on the error object?
Oh, I haven't worked with JavaScript errors an awful lot. You might be able just to console log the error and it might just automatically toString it. I'm not sure. Probably if you're going to be concatenating it or using it in a template, it's probably better because otherwise it might just say error object. That's something you can play around with. I think it's common just to console log the error itself. Yeah.
Do you have these blocks that are one statement? Do you have to put them curly braces?
No, a lot of this is because in the slides, I want the font to be big enough to be easily readable, and it makes it hard to put everything on one line. Yeah. But yes, you're right. The curly braces are not necessary.
Just to confirm, so automatically the arguments that are passed into then arguments that are passed into catch are just set up in promises that it's always like you get data out, then data is going into then. If you get an error, then the error is going into that catch.
Well, we'll see when we create our own promise at the end that you can control what these two things do. Yeah, yeah.
So every time you have done it.
Yes. Otherwise, you're going to get this unhandled promise rejection warning if the promise happens to get into a rejected state.
So it's just like it's better to have just.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Is there any? You go to the other slide. Is there anything going on with the statements, implicit return, arrow functions.
Oh,
Arrow function.
well, there is no implicit return because I'm using braces, right? So these are both returning undefined. We'll talk a little bit about what dot then returns in just a minute. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Chaining. Dot then. Dot then function. It returns a new promise. And this new promise is different from the original. And this is what you're going to want to use when you need to do several asynchronous operations and each needs to wait for the previous one to finish. Right? We saw, if we go back here, that you can't do asynchronous operations in series. If I wanted done running DB query to happen, I would have to put it in the dot then if I wanted it to happen after the other one. But what if the dot then had something asynchronous itself? Yeah, so that's where the chaining comes in. Okay, so here I'll take a minute just to talk about this example, just to set up some context for this example. So I'm just using this iTunes search. It's something, I just wanted something that returns JSON. So if I do an iTunes search, because this is set up to download JSON, but just basically it returns JSON. And I can, let's go back here. And if I, just annoying me now. All right, so now if I'm just gonna use this because I can copy and paste more easily. So if I do search with term equals whatever, it's going to give me back JSON. And again, here it's downloading the JSON, but the JSON has it's an object with two keys. One is the result count, one is the results. Results is an array of another object, which gives me anything that matches my tag, whatever. Okay, so yeah, so somebody gave their track name that has a song named whatever, right? And then you look and there's a bunch of different information. This isn't a lecture on the iTunes API. I just wanted you to see what we're working with here. Okay, so and then I'm going to do a fetch in honor of Jared. I'm going to use cheese here as my term. And then I'm going to do response. And here I have response.json. Response.json in fetch is another async function that returns a promise. So here I'm getting the response. That response has stuff like headers and it has the body, but it isn't necessarily complete. And so response.json waits for it to complete and then returns a promise. So this then function is returning another promise, which I am then doing a dot then on that promise. When the promise from this function is fulfilled, I want to run a callback with songs being my argument, and songs is going to be this object. And then for each song, I'm just going to console log its track name. So first, I need to wait for it to get the URL. Once it gets the URL, I need to wait for it to complete retrieving the data and turn it into JSON. Once I get the JSON, so this is the response from the URL, the response object. This is the JSON from that response object, from the body. And then I can finally do what I need. Now these two have to be synchronous. I can't say I want this URL, I get this partial response, and then with the partial response, I want to try and get the body out, right? I need to wait until the response is complete, which is what the response.json does for me. And then I can start looking at the results. And I think, was it you, Misha, who was saying about you have to have a catch? Yeah. And so this catch, the nice thing about this catch is it will catch an error in this then callback or an error in this then callback. Yeah, Misha.
So just to so I don't need a catch for every bin. I can have several bins and then have one catch to catch every bin.
Exactly
Okay,
right.
no,
Yes.
'cause my download would make
Catch for every then. Yeah. Which is what you need to do for callbacks, but you don't need to do it for promises, which is one of the advantages. Yes.
that makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, other questions on this, on the chaining? It's a little vague here about why this is asynchronous. It's like if you have the response, why do you need to like wait for the response JSON? It's just the way fetch works. Fetch will actually do its callback when it gets the beginning of the response. And you have to wait until you've gotten all of those chunks of data before doing the JSON. Okay, so let's actually see this work. Okay, so those are all of the titles of the tracks that somehow included cheese in their metadata, right? This one's obvious. Who knows why Monkeys had cheese in it? Maybe the artist's name included cheese or the album name included cheese or whatever, right? Yeah, okay. All right. Are we ready to move on to creating promises, or are there some more questions about using promises?
What's fetch? Is that like a library?
Yeah, fetch is a library. The library is node fetch. So, and I think it's different, like HTTP or something. I don't know what you use here, but yeah. So if we look at the package.json, it's just node fetch. Yeah.
I know they use fetch in phase 3 also.
Okay, in phase 3 they use fetch. So.
The fetch is just a promise library.
Well, it is a library that retrieves URLs. It retrieves responses from URLs. It sends requests and retrieves responses from URLs, and it works with promises. Its function fetch, and let's see. So up here, what I did was I just said fetch is require node fetch, and this function fetch returns a promise. Right? And if I want to break out all the promises, I could say const fetch promise equals this, and then I can say fetch promise dot then, and I can say const let's see, JSON promise equals fetch promise dot then. And then, yeah, and then I can say fetch promise .then songs, and then this will catch anything that was up there.
I like your original one.
Yeah, but I do just want to emphasize that these promises are just objects. They're just objects, and you can deal with them independently. But yes, no, yeah, the original one is much more common. But I think this demystifies the promises a little bit. It's like, oh, it's an object that has a .then method.
That returns a promise.
How come the fetch promise .then songs instead of JSON promise?
Oh, that was thank you for asking. The question was why fetch instead of JSON? Yeah, that was just me making a mistake. Thanks for asking.
So this, just to clarify, like the usage of these. So basically, we're starting a project. We have a package. We see if that package returns promises, and we're going to be using these promises in our projects.
You are consuming the promises. That also.
Set up like that, it'll still work. It'll still.
You know,
catch the-
I'm actually not positive. Let's give it something weird here that it's not going to be able to use, and let's see what happens. Yep. So it still caught that error that came from this bad URL.
When?
Because you're calling it on the song title promise
Oh, I got it.
variable, whereas like the fetch is actually. So maybe it's chaining through.
You know, this really is identical, because when you do the .catch, you're saying, I want to call the .catch on whatever comes out of this .then, right? And what comes out of this .then? The song title promise. Yeah, good. It's good. Like, this also forces you to understand chaining a little bit more. What's that? Build a promise. Okay. So, okay, creating promises. All right, so basically we're just going to use the constructor. Again, it's just like making a new error object or a new date object or a new array. We're going to use the constructor. And so the way the syntax works, oh, stop it. How can I just get that thing to go away? By the way, I need to transition off of Google presentations, but I have not had time yet, but I'm going to use something slimmer than this eventually. All right. So promise is an object, create it with the constructor. And what we do, okay, so you say const my promise equals new promise. That should just look familiar. That's how you construct objects in JavaScript. Promise takes what data type? What data type is the parameter for promise? A function. So when you make a new promise, it takes a function. It's a callback function that has resolve and reject as the arguments. And for that function, you do something asynchronously. And if you determine somehow that it succeeds, and if it does, then you want to run this resolve callback. So this whole thing is a function, but this is a function too. Resolve is a function and reject is a function. And so if somehow it succeeded, this is pseudocode here, it's not real code, you're going to resolve, you're going to run this resolve function on whatever your async result is. And that is the function, if we go back here, that is the function here. This right now is the resolve function that gets run on whatever the result was. This turns into the resolve function, or a resolve function for the promise.
So you could set up, like in that example, you could set up the song star results to a variable, or to a variable, and same with the catch, and then put those into .then. Like if you, I know that's for this different.
Yeah, I mean, what I could do is I could say song title promise dot then. I could give song title promise another dot then, and I could say songs, I don't know, console log songs dot, I think it was result count. It's just another thing that's going to be treated like that resolve. It's another resolve callback for song title, for the song title promise. You can have more than one, and it'll run all of them in succession.
Say that again.
Yeah, you can have more than one resolve function on a promise. You have to do it like this. You can't chain it, because if you chain it, this is returning something. Oh, actually, it's probably the JSON promise. Sorry, this is the JSON. So the JSON promise, I want to give it two resolve things, two things to do when it resolves. One is this dot then function, and one is this dot then function. You can't chain it because this dot then function is returning song title promise. JSON promise is gone after this is run. So in order to add more than one resolve, you do have to bind it to a variable like this. Well, when I chain it, yeah, that's sort of a weird thing to say. But so I'm going to take all of this, and I want to leave it the way it is for now, but I'm going to now go back to chaining. And so if I say fetch dot then dot then dot then dot catch, this dot then is working on whatever this dot then returned. And frankly, this dot then didn't return anything. It returned undefined. I want this dot then to work on what this returned. I wanted to get the access to that same songs that got returned from this.
Why did that one return?
Say one more time.
Why did you said it returned undefined?
Well, this one here. So this one, I'm returning whatever promise comes from response.json, right? Because this is sort of the equivalent. It's just because of the, right? But this one, what is this function returning? It's not returning anything. I could, I believe, 95% sure, if I return songs here, that we'll be able to just use it again. But you got to be careful. And then this is working on an entirely new promise. It's not working on this one up here. An entirely new promise that happens to have the same value.
That's the difference, like setting them to a variable, you can kind of see, or like break apart what exactly the value is going to be and then decide to do it. But this is just like,
yeah. And usually this is what you want to do. Usually you don't really care about adding more than one to one particular promise, adding more than one resolve function, but yeah, you just, like, the key thing that I want, yeah, you to remember is that this one is returning a different promise than this one here. Okay, and then reject is the callback. Reject is what is going to get called if there's an error. So reject, and reject, you're going to give it some sort of failure message. So for example, when this got rejected, when PG Promise rejected my query, it gave me an error with the message column a pony doesn't exist. So just like resolve, just like the resolve gets an argument, the error gets an argument as well. The reject function gets an argument as well. Like this one here? Or do you mean like back to the code? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so fetch gets the URL.
Mhm.
The first bit is a response to what fetch just got.
Right.
Then the next bit is pretty much going, okay, from what you just got, go in and get this argument, which is solved,
Mm-hmm.
which, like you said, is not going to return anything, which is saying, okay, then the next line is saying, songs were the results of songs for each song. Give me the track.
Yeah, or just
Not
print.
return,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
print out the
Yeah.
track.
And then I changed this to return songs,
Right.
so that now this dot then will return a promise with a value of songs, which I can then access here.
So, and that's why I wanted to just clarify. So from the second bin that has the argument of songs, you couldn't do the third argument, basically the third bin with songs without a return. That's what
Right, right. Because this is working on whatever promise was returned from this then.
but you didn't return anything, so that makes
Yeah.
sense. Okay. All right.
I
let's
just wanna make sure that this works. Hold on, because I'm okay.
I appreciate this. For me, it reminds me of patty cake.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
tossing.
this,
Yeah.
have other hand, it-
Okay, yeah, so we got 50. Yeah, so it was able to do that, but if I didn't return songs here,
Right, that's what
oopsie, we can't read result count of undefined,
okay.
because I'm trying to read result count of songs, and songs is undefined.
Okay. That
When you return songs, or you said it returns a promise with value of songs, promise object. Okay. So promise is an object with those two values or functions that resolve. Failure one is called
Yeah, rejection.
rejection. And so I guess in that follow it goes songs over here is it's the value of this JSON stuff.
Yeah, so this JSON, this response.json returns a promise. And so it's a little bit, here I'm actually returning a promise, and here I'm just returning a value, and the promise is robust enough to take either. Here it'll do it'll give you the promise. Here it'll make its own promise with just this value.
Okay.
It's a little confusing.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, Bob raised his hand. So, what's that? Yeah, he raised his hand. I got a message. What is the type of songs? Okay, so that was a fun little excursion. Okay, so yeah, so each dot then, So dot then returns a promise. That's what dot then does. Every dot then returns a promise, whether you use it or not. If you happen to chain a dot then onto that promise, then you're going to be doing whatever the resolve, then you're going to be giving a resolve function for the promise that, that you're currently dealing with. Here, this one, when I returned response.json, response.json happens to return a promise as it is. So it's the response.json promise that gets used here. The response.json promise is the thing that is going to be applied to this next dot then. Here I'm just returning songs, which is an object, as Vaibhav clarified. And so because that's not a promise, the dot then wraps it in a promise so that I can run another dot then. Okay, we got a little sidetracked from our promise creation. All right, so I have this lucky day promise. It's a little silly, but it's what I got. So, so here, I'm just making a new date for today. So today is just a new date. And in general, what if I just do a new date without any arguments, it'll just do whatever the time is when I make that new date. Fine. Now I'm making this new promise called Lucky Day, and I want to give it a resolve and reject. First, I want to do something asynchronously. So I'm doing this set timeout, so it'll do it asynchronously. That's just sort of me. I mean, this is obviously kind of a nonsensical example of a promise, but in general, the asynchronous thing might be going to get a data from a URL, or it might be going to get a response from the database. Here, my asynchronous is I'm just going to wait a second. Fine. And then I'm going to get whatever the seconds count was for the date today. So if it was, exactly on the hour, get seconds would return 0. And if it was exactly on the minute, I should say. If it was 3 seconds past the minute, then get seconds would return 3. If it was 37 seconds past the minute, get seconds would return 37. Now I'm saying if it's evenly divisible by 3, you win. Success. I'm going to say resolve, and I'm going to give whatever the second count was. If it's not evenly divisible by 3, sorry, you're not lucky. I'm going to reject. So here I have my promise, and my promise is not getting returned from a function, so I can just use my promise and say dot then. It's a promise. Dot then, when is dot then going to actually happen? What is the circumstance for me to run this function that's within dot then? Dot then means the promise was fulfilled, right? Not rejected. My promise is fulfilled if the number of seconds happens to be divisible by 3. Once it hits this resolve, it's going to change the state of the promise to fulfilled. It hits the reject, change the state of the promise to rejected. Okay, so dot then, and notice that I'm returning the second count here. So I can use that second count, and I can say hooray for that many seconds. Or if I got rejected, I'm just going to say too bad and whatever the error is. Here the error is a string, but I could return an error object also if I wanted to. So when the people in PG Promise made the promise that got returned from the dot query, they ran the query synchronously. When the query came back, if there was no error, then they'll resolve with the data from the query. If there was an error, they'll reject with an error, with either a string or an error object that indicates the error. Okay, so when I run this program, it's going to get whatever the date is now. Then it's just going to create the promise. Once it creates the promise, then I'm going to actually run a dot then on the promise. Is the promise going to resolve, or is it going to be rejected? So let's see how that works. Okay, it's waiting a second. Oh, it was divisible by 33. So we were lucky, right? If I do it again, oh, 39, amazing. Oh my gosh, okay. I actually did this. I did this because, oh, dear, fine. I actually did 2 seconds when I was practicing this at home, and 2 seconds I was actually getting it every time, but apparently here it's taking me more like 3 seconds to reset versus the 2 seconds it was taking me at home. So you'd think that 1 and 3, but whatever. Apparently I just take 3 seconds to reset, so every time. Yeah. All right, not a lucky time. We went kind of fast through the promise creation, which is okay because really you're going to be using promises more than you are going to be creating. But the promise creation helps you understand sort of what's under the hood. Even more to help you to understand what's under the hood is this lecture of Trevor's. There's a link to it. I'll send out the slides, but there's a link to this lecture of Trevor's where he actually creates a promise library. He actually, yeah, so what he does is instead of doing new promise like I did, you're going to do new and then Trevor's promise, and he actually implements it, and it's really helpful for understanding what's going on under the hood with promises. And then, like I said, when I was making this lecture, I was just reading, creating promises, and using promises. Those were my key sources for this lecture. I like MDN. Yeah.
So you don't necessarily have to use promises for like you don't want, like, you could use it within something that's like local to what you're doing rather than like always querying a server. I feel like it's seen like that, but I've always seen it used for querying servers mostly.
So yeah, so the question is, like, promises are always used for querying servers. It's really for any asynchronous action. For when you want to say, I want to set this task off doing something, and then later when the task is finished, I want you to do whatever you do if it's successful or failing, depending on the status of the task. Other questions? Yeah, this may take a while to digest. Yeah, Aisha.
It makes perfect sense to me. I guess, how is it any different than the way a callback works?
Yeah, so the question is, how is it any different from the way a callback works? And the main differences are you can chain promises, whereas with callbacks, you have to nest them, which makes for ugly pyramid style code. And you can use a dot catch on a promise chain so that you don't have to have a different error callback for every asynchronous action. You can just have one error callback for a series of asynchronous actions. Those are the main differences. Okay. Thanks, guys. The video and the slides will be available probably after lunch.
Thanks.